The room was built for intimidation. Cold walls, fluorescent lights that never stopped buzzing, and a metal table bolted to the floor. She sat there calmly, hands resting on the table as if she were waiting for a meeting, not an interrogation. Her clothes were standard, civilian, unremarkable. No ID tag, no clearance badge, no escort. To the guards, that meant one thing: she didn't belong. The moment she crossed the restricted line outside, someone radioed it in. 2 men approached, firm voices, practiced aggression. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. And maybe that made them angrier. In a place where even generals show their badges twice, her silence was taken as defiance. They grabbed her by the arm first, asking who she was and where she thought she was going. She said nothing. When one of them tightened his grip, she finally turned her head. Her eyes didn't flash. She didn't glare. But something in the way she looked at him made the younger one hesitate. The older one didn't. He yanked her forward by the collar, ready to shove her to the wall. That was the moment everything started to change. A glint of thread, barely visible beneath the collar's edge. It wasn't rank. It wasn't decorative. But for the trained eye, especially one that had seen combat, that had read certain files, that had been there, it was unmistakable. A sliver of dark silver woven into matte black, shaped like a fractured triangle with no unit designation. She didn't flinch as her collar was pulled. But the chief, who had just entered the corridor, froze. The 2 men didn't see him at first. They were still mid-motion when his voice cut the air, not loud, not angry. Just precise. Cold. Let her go. At first, they hesitated. Then turned. And that's when they saw the chief's face. He wasn't staring at them. He was staring at the emblem. That tiny stitch. His expression, so often unreadable, had dropped into something else. Not fear. Not confusion. Something between memory and shock. The older guard let go. Slowly. Like he suddenly realized he'd touched something radioactive. She stood upright, adjusted her collar. Still silent. The chief walked forward, 1 step at a time, each footfall echoing off the corridor walls. His eyes never left her collar. The guard stepped aside. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she spoke. I need to speak with someone who has clearance above Echo 7. That level didn't exist on paper. Most soldiers had never heard of it. Those who had never said the name out loud. The chief's throat tightened. He looked around, then back at her. You were decommissioned. Her answer came instantly. So were a lot of things. But not all of them stayed buried. That was the moment the room turned colder. Even the buzzing lights seemed quieter. He motioned for her to follow, and she did silently, smoothly. The way someone walks who's memorized a place in a different decade. They passed checkpoint after checkpoint, doors unlocking with codes no one else used anymore. The guards who saw them didn't ask questions. Some of them nodded. Some averted their gaze. Word had started to spread. Not through whispers or chatter, but through silence. The kind of silence that means something unspeakable is standing in the room. By the time she reached the interrogation chamber, a classified seal had been manually keyed into the system. The camera feed stopped transmitting. The internal mics were disabled. The door locked from inside with a rotating cipher last used in '09. She sat down again. Same table. Same posture. But now no one dared to question why she was there. The chief remained standing, his arms folded, his breathing shallow. He hadn't seen that emblem in 16 years. And the last time he did, it was in a file marked Eyes Only, which had vanished from archives 3 months after it was sealed. No one ever expected someone from that program to walk back through the doors. Especially not dressed like a civilian. Especially not unannounced. And yet here she was. Her presence alone raised alarms buried under 10 layers of protocol. And her silence said more than any threat ever could. The interrogation wasn't about what she had done. It wasn't even about who she was. It was about what her presence meant. Because she wasn't supposed to exist. Not anymore. The emblem was barely visible. A flicker of metallic thread woven so subtly into the underside of her collar that even trained personnel would have overlooked it. But not him. Not the chief. His eyes had seen too much, cataloged too many secrets, survived too many missions that were never supposed to happen. And this symbol, it wasn't part of any division currently in operation. It wasn't even supposed to be worn in public. Classified doesn't begin to cover it. It wasn't a unit patch or rank or deployment token. It was an emblem from a deep code task force so far beneath the surface, even the intelligence communities called it vapor. No name, no badge, no trace. The kind of group created in shadows, deployed without acknowledgement, and erased once their use had expired. Except she still wore the mark. The moment the chief saw it, he stopped walking. His breath caught, not in fear, but in the cold recognition of something he thought he'd never see again. His mind rushed through memories he'd buried under years of classified debriefs and encrypted hard drives. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the temperature of the room seemed to drop. The guards who'd laid hands on her were still standing there, now awkward and pale, unsure why the air had shifted. They hadn't noticed what he saw, but they could feel it. The chief stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on the edge of her collar. His voice was softer now, not because he was uncertain, but because certain truths don't need to be shouted. "Where did you get that?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He already knew. That insignia wasn't something you found, or bought, or recreated. It was issued once. Burned into gear during black site briefings. Not for identification, but for warning. This one cannot be traced. The emblem existed in only 2 forms. Buried in old files locked behind 3 levels of biometric gates, and stitched onto those who were willing to vanish into the kind of missions that erased names from every record. She hadn't just served. She had disappeared. He recalled one file in particular. Operation Firewell. The briefing was delivered verbally. No notes. No logs. Just coordinates and a voice warning. If they get caught, we didn't send them. If they die, we never knew them. If they succeed, we'll deny it happened. The chief had been younger then, part of the clearance chain but too junior to ask questions. He remembered hearing whispers about a woman with field skills so sharp she'd been flagged as an irregular asset. Someone who didn't exist on any roster but whose actions turned up in redacted mission logs. That emblem, that thread, it matched what little he'd seen in one surveillance photo once passed around behind closed doors after a failed extraction in Belarus. A blurred figure walking out of a firestorm alone, a triangular shimmer on her shoulder. The picture had been deleted within minutes, but the shape was unforgettable, and now it was in front of him again. He turned to the guards, gesturing them out with a nod. They obeyed instantly. Whatever was happening here was now above their pay grade. Once the door closed, the silence was heavier. She looked up at him for the first time, not challenging, not cold. Just steady. He couldn't help the question. "You're not supposed to be here." Her voice came low, even. Neither are a lot of truths. He studied her again. Her posture, her presence, her control. Everything about her screamed discipline, but not the kind trained in academies or drills. This was something older. Sharper. Like she'd carried secrets heavier than most people's careers. His mind raced. If she was here wearing that, it meant someone at a very high level had either authorized her presence or lost control of something far bigger. Either way, she wasn't alone. Even if no one else walked in, her presence meant she carried access, knowledge, and leverage. The emblem beneath her collar didn't glow or pulse, but it didn't have to. It carried history. It carried blood. It carried silence enforced by men who never spoke twice. And now, after more than a decade of being forgotten by everyone who thought they'd cleaned the slate, it was back. Not on a screen. Not in a rumor. But worn by someone standing less than 5 feet away, looking him in the eyes as if nothing about it was strange. The file didn't have a name. Just a red band across the top and a security code that hadn't been used since the Cold War. Even accessing it required a biometric override, and even then, all that came up was a brief. 6 lines, a set of coordinates, and a timestamp that didn't line up with any known operation. It was buried so deep in the system that even the retrieval had triggered 3 silent alarms. The chief remembered when he first saw it, not because he was supposed to, but because someone in a dark hallway once said to him, "You're going to hear about a mission we never launched. Don't ask where it came from. Just be ready when the pieces start moving." The mission had no call sign. The team had no names. And the location, a facility in the Arctic Circle, didn't exist on any map. It was the kind of assignment that came without briefing folders or backup. Just a voice, a burner phone, and a number to destroy after the message played. That was the world she came from. Whoever she was now, whatever name she answered to, none of it matched the woman in that file. Because that woman didn't exist. She'd been constructed, activated, then erased. A tactical ghost. Trained to walk into operations and vanish without a footprint. The classified emblem under her collar wasn't a relic. It was a code, one that connected her directly to that erased mission. And that emblem had only ever been issued to one subset of personnel. Task Unit Ember, though even that title was unofficial. The name only existed in a single memo intercepted by accident and flagged for deletion within seconds. The contents of that memo were simple. Ember's work ends when the memory of fire is gone. Ember was a last resort. When diplomacy failed, when force compromised too much, and when even special forces couldn't be trusted with what needed to be done, Ember was activated. No base, no chain of command, just objectives and outcomes. The chief had tried once, just once, to trace it back. He'd followed a requisition order for medical equipment tied to Ember's supposed operatives. But the trail dissolved into falsified requisitions and off-grid black sites. One location was listed in the Mojave. When his team got there, it was just sand and sun until one of them stepped into a minefield that hadn't been active for 20 years. Someone had anticipated the search. Someone had buried the past deeper than policy allowed. There were rumors that Ember ran only 4 full missions. High-risk, zero-deniability targets. None of them were on record. All of them left a trail of silence. No survivors, no evidence, and no known photographs. But there were whispers about a woman who entered a North Korean base dressed as a nurse and walked out through the back gate carrying a satchel of data drives. About a failed coup in Sudan that reversed itself overnight. About a Russian general who defected, then vanished en route to extraction, only to be found years later running a bookstore in Oslo, missing half his memories. Every rumor came back to the same profile, a woman, quiet, precise, always 2 steps ahead. Unkillable. Unseen. Now she sat across from the chief, wearing a civilian jacket and carrying nothing but her presence. The emblem wasn't a provocation. It was a key. A signal that something long dormant had been reactivated or had never truly been shut down. He remembered a meeting with a senior official who once said, "There are missions too dangerous to remember. So we don't. We build them into people who disappear before anyone can write them down." She was one of them. Which raised the question, if she was here now, if she had returned to the grid after all this time, was the mission unfinished or was something bigger coming? Was she a warning? A message? A weapon waiting to be triggered again? The classified mission tied to that emblem was designed to leave no legacy. No medals. No reports. Just silence. And now that silence had broken. The mission that never existed had returned in human form. Walking through secured doors like a ghost slipping back into a story no one was supposed to hear again. He hadn't thought about that night in years. Not consciously, at least. But now, standing face to face with her, the memories weren't coming back in pieces. They were slamming into him like a wave. The firefight, the radio silence, the strobe of infrared beams sweeping across their position, and the realization that they were cut off. His unit had been deployed under the assumption that it was a surveillance op infiltrate. Record. Exfilled before anyone knew they were there. Standard procedure. What they didn't know was that the intel was compromised before they even landed. The hillside was supposed to be empty. Instead, it lit up with muzzle flashes and burning debris. Half his team was down before they even returned fire. Communications were jammed. Their satellite link went dead within 30 seconds of boots on the ground. The chief, then just Lieutenant Monroe, had taken cover behind an overturned transport with 2 surviving squad members. One was bleeding out. The other had already stopped moving. They were done. That was the moment she appeared. Not with a flashbang or a scream. She didn't storm in, didn't bark orders. She moved like a shadow, precise, deliberate, deadly. He remembered the blur of her silhouette as she cleared a perimeter by herself. 2 guards dropped without a sound. A third turned just in time to see the glint of her blade before collapsing in the snow. He hadn't even seen her face. Just the emblem on her shoulder, dark, almost indistinguishable, like it didn't want to be seen. He didn't know what unit she belonged to. She didn't identify herself. She didn't speak. She saved his life. She pulled him and the last conscious operator out from behind the wreckage and moved them through enemy lines like a ghost slipping between thoughts. Every movement was calculated. Every shot she took was final. It wasn't just her skill, it was the silence. The cold, clinical way she moved through chaos. Like she'd rehearsed it 100 times in rooms no one else was allowed to enter. They reached the exfil point 10 minutes before the drone strike flattened the entire area. When he turned to ask her name, she was already gone. For years, Monroe convinced himself he'd hallucinated her, that his memory had blurred under the pressure of combat stitched together with adrenaline and fear. But deep down, he knew she had been real. He'd seen the way the others reacted. He'd seen the aftermath. Trails of bodies with zero traces left behind. Cameras wiped, access logs deleted. He filed a report anyway, scrubbed it of anything specific, called her an unidentified asset. But someone must have seen it, because 2 days later he was pulled into a debrief where a man in a charcoal suit slid a folder across the table and said, "You didn't see who you think you saw. That folder was empty." He signed a form he wasn't allowed to read, and the incident vanished from his service record. But now here she was, sitting across from him again, unchanged. Not in her face. No, that was older, more worn. But in her presence. That same calm. That same silence that demanded attention without asking for it. He felt the weight of the years between then and now. The promotions. The desks. The silence he carried every time he looked in the mirror and remembered a night that no longer existed. And now, seeing her again, it confirmed what he had suspected all along. That someone had lied to him. That whatever program she was part of hadn't been shut down, only buried deeper. His memory wasn't failing. It had been suppressed. She didn't bring up that mission. Didn't mention his name. She simply watched him as if waiting for him to catch up. And he did. Not with anger. Not with fear. With respect. With the dawning realization that the stories whispered in classified corridors, the ones everyone laughed off, were never stories at all. They were warnings. She had once walked through gunfire to pull him out of a grave. And now, without speaking a word, she'd walked back into his life carrying every shadow she had ever stepped through. It happened in a second. One blink, one breath, and the entire dynamic in the room flipped like a switch had been thrown. Before that moment, the officers stood tall, rigid in their positions, full of protocol and posture. She was the outsider, the anomaly. No credentials presented, no rank announced. Just a woman in plain civilian clothes, sitting in a secured facility where civilians never walked freely. They had labeled her a breach, a security threat, an unknown variable to be neutralized or removed. But then the chief saw the emblem. That sliver of fabric no larger than a fingernail tucked beneath the fold of her collar changed everything. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand or signal with rank. He simply looked. And that look from a man who had never been known to flinch was enough to send unease rippling through the entire room. The officers noticed his expression change first, his jaw tightening, his stare anchoring itself on her with the weight of memory. No one spoke. Then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, as though every step toward her came with the burden of classified history. He circled her chair once, stopping just behind her shoulder. She didn't flinch. Didn't turn. She just sat there, steady as a metronome, letting the silence build. And then the chief broke the rules. He reached forward, not in aggression, but with the reverence of someone handling something sacred, and adjusted her collar just enough to expose the emblem fully. The room collectively stiffened. What they saw didn't make sense. There was no unit insignia, no national identifier. Just a broken triangular shape, ink black and trimmed with silver. No one said a word. But in those few seconds, every person in that room felt something they hadn't felt in years, uncertainty. Because they didn't recognize the symbol. And worse, they saw that the chief did. One of the younger officers cleared his throat, trying to pull the conversation back into protocol. "Sir, should we verify? Stand down." The chief's voice wasn't raised, but it hit like a hammer. The kind of tone that stopped conversations, orders, and breath. Another officer, more seasoned, tried a different approach. "With respect, Commander, this woman has bypassed 3 levels of she's not a woman," the chief interrupted again, louder now. "She's an asset." That word hit harder than any rank or name. Asset. Not agent. Not operative. Not personnel. That word was reserved for something else entirely, something classified so deep the files didn't even carry clearance ratings. Assets weren't assigned. They were activated. The officers exchanged glances, but none dared speak again. Then the most unthinkable thing happened. The chief stepped around the table and gave a nod, not a command, not a request. A nod. A silent acknowledgement between equals. And she stood. Her movement was smooth, precise. She didn't look at anyone else. She only met the chief's eyes. For a moment they seemed to communicate without sound. A war of silence passed between them, both veterans of something unspoken. Then the chief turned back to his own men. You will not log her presence. You will not write this interaction down. You will not speak of it. But sir, if this gets documented, the chief said, you won't have to worry about court-martial. You won't exist long enough for a tribunal. The room fell dead silent. Chain of command wasn't supposed to collapse like this. Orders flowed downward. Protocols were reinforced by structure. But here, with one silent symbol, the entire system had bent without a word. She didn't bark orders. She didn't assert dominance. Her silence did all the talking. Every officer in that room, men who had deployed into war zones, survived interrogations, held command over hundreds, now stood motionless, unsure of how to proceed. Because their rules had never accounted for someone like her. The hierarchy meant nothing. She wasn't part of it. She was above it. And as she and the chief walked out of the room together, the silence left behind wasn't just confusion. It was fear. The kind of fear born not from threat, but from witnessing something that proves your entire understanding of power is incomplete. She didn't offer her name. She never had. The room didn't need it anymore. Not after the emblem. Not after the silence she carried like a weapon. But the chief already knew what the others didn't, that this wasn't her first return to a facility like this. She had walked in before, always without announcement, always when something critical was about to collapse. And each time she left behind more questions than answers. Now, in the dim interior of the chief's private briefing room, away from the other officers, she finally spoke. I'm not here for closure. I'm here because the asset chain's been broken. The words hit harder than a warning. They weren't just a status report, they were a verdict. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, studying her. She looked older now. Not in years, but in weight. The kind of aging that only comes from carrying things most people aren't meant to know. Her eyes held too much. Not regret, not sorrow, just memory. Precise, brutal, and locked in place like a loaded trigger. What happened? He asked. She placed a black data chip on the table between them. No markings. No digital signature. Just a small anode object that looked harmless. It's all on there. Names. Leaks. Reinstated assets who weren't cleared. Someone pulled strings above Echo 7. And someone else noticed. The chief stared at the chip but didn't touch it. Not yet. The breach, he asked quietly. She nodded. Deliberate. And it's not just intelligence. There's movement. Units are being reshaped. Protocols you wrote are being rewritten. The people behind this think Ember doesn't exist anymore. His face tightened. Of course they did. Ember had been designed to vanish. A program with no footprint, no funding trail, no digital infrastructure. Its operatives weren't listed under branches. They were shadows trained to operate across all terrains, all jurisdictions, without ever triggering attention. And when Ember was decommissioned, if it ever truly was, everything tied to it was supposed to be erased. Except her. Except this. I stayed buried because the work was done, she said, her voice even. I came back because someone started digging. The chief let the silence stretch. He had been part of the team that signed off on her exit. Not a discharge, just removal. She had completed her missions, surpassed every threshold. She had been granted a full erasure. Identity dissolved. Tracking shut down. Memory sealed. But somewhere along the way, she hadn't stayed buried. You never stopped watching, did you? No, she replied simply. Because I knew the game wasn't over. Just paused. He looked at her hands. No tremble. No hesitation. She wasn't here to ask for help. She was here to announce her presence. That she had returned. That she was active again. Not because someone gave her orders, but because the silence she had once preserved had been violated. They found one of the old stashes, she continued. Off-grid black site. Unindexed. But someone had the clearance to open it. Not just enter, reactivate it. They accessed code sequences even I never had. That means one of the originals flipped. The implications sank in. Ember had only ever had a handful of command-level operatives. If one of them had turned, it meant the entire structure, designed to exist without structure, was vulnerable. How many know you're back? He asked. Only the ones who need to. And me. She looked at him then. You always knew I would be. He didn't deny it. The truth behind the collar wasn't just the emblem. It wasn't just the file or the missions or the ghosts she carried with her. It was her identity, not one she was born with, but one she had become. She wasn't a name or a number. She was a safeguard. A final protocol against corruption within the very walls that claimed to uphold order. And now, by revealing herself again, she had set something in motion. The chief understood the cost. Her presence alone was a statement, a declaration that the things they once buried had not only survived but had returned with purpose. He finally reached for the chip, held it in his hand like it was a relic. "Does this go public?" he asked. Her answer was colder than any threat. "It goes where it has to." Because the truth behind the collar wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about proving who she was. It was about warning those who thought they had won, that the silence they thought meant victory was simply waiting.